Welcome to the Next Level Human podcast. As a human, you have a job to do. In fact, you have 4 jobs: to earn and manage money, to attain and maintain health and fitness, to build and sustain personal relationships, to find meaning and make a difference. None of these jobs are taught in school, and that is what this podcast is designed to do. To educate us all on living our most fulfilled lives through the mastery of these 4 jobs. I'm your host, Dr. Jade, Teta, and I believe we are here living this life for 3 reasons and 3 reasons only: to learn, to teach, and to love. In this podcast, I will be learning, teaching, and loving right along with you. I'm grateful to have your company. Here's to our next level. Today's episode is going to be to address topics that have been coming up since I did my interview with Dr. Herman Ponzer. And so those of you who missed that particular interview, that was an interview all about what we now know about exercise and how it's working for us or against us. And real quick, let me give you that particular episode number, just looking at it here really quickly, because it is one that you're probably going to want to refer back to. So this is episode 108, and this was a discussion with Dr. Herman Ponzer, who's a evolutionary anthropologist and an expert in exercise energy use, and how exercise is not what we think it is. He's one of the people who have made some pretty startling discoveries about how our body adapts to exercise, and how and why exercise is not the best thing to prioritize when we are trying to lose fat. Now, that being said, it's a little bit tricky, right? And so when I did this episode, I got a ton of questions from you that said, well, Jade, what does this mean? Does this mean I don't exercise? Does this mean, what about, high intensity interval training? And what about weight training? And, aren't there differences between exercises? And all of these questions that really came up about, is exercise useless? How should I be looking at this? And so the short answer is absolutely not. Exercise is not useless, and it's actually critical for your fat loss goals, just not in the way that we initially thought it was. So let's start off with some review here in terms of Dr. Herman Ponzer's work, and then we'll get into what type of exercise should you be doing and how much, and just a whole discussion about this. So first of all, here's what Dr. Herman Ponzer found. One of the things that, if you are into the biohacking space or into the paleo space or into nutrition, you have probably heard this argument before that we should be living as our paleo ancestors, our hunter-gatherer ancestors, which is kind of a dubious claim in a sense, because these individuals did not live very long, healthy lives, mostly because they were having to deal with very high infant mortality rates. Injuries would kill people back then. They didn't have emergency rooms and things like that. They frequently were prey. They had food insecurity. There would be times when they would starve. In other words, food was not as plentiful at times. And so there were all kinds of issues for these individuals. Not to mention, we've kind of gotten to this, sort of what some people might call the paleo delusion, which is this idea that anything, our ancestors were doing is much better than what we are currently doing. And this is partly true and partly not. You get a little bit of this discussion with Herman Ponzer. It's partly true because these individuals who made it past infancy and childhood and did not succumb due to infection from these very high infant and toddler mortality rates and childhood mortality rates, and could survive past, being food and things like this, lived very long, healthy lives. In fact, when we look at individuals today who are modern day hunter-gatherers, who Dr. Herman Ponzer actually has lived with all of these, sort of the Shuar, the Shamani, the different, the Hadza, the different Paleolithic communities or hunter-gatherer communities that currently exist. When we look at these people, they tend to be much, much healthier than the average Westerner. However, to his surprise, and one of the things that he did is he went out there and said, well, we've always said, that they're healthier than us because they move more. So maybe it has to do with their diet and because they're moving a ton. And they do move a ton. So what he wanted to do is he went out and said, well, how are they moving? How are they exercising? Which, by the way, very quickly, let's distinguish between moving, which is just activities of daily living, gathering, walking, climbing trees, all of these kind of things, versus exercising, which would be sprinting and lifting for a particular reason. These people really didn't exercise per se, but they moved a ton. And so Dr. Herman Ponzer wanted to know how much more movement and exercise were they getting, and to what degree was their total daily energy use, their TDEE, or total daily energy expenditure, much more than ours, and to what degree did this explain the vast differences in obesity and chronic disease. And so obviously they're moving a ton more. To give you an idea, based on Dr. Herman Ponzer's work, the men in these hunter-gatherer tribes are walking anywhere from 15,000 steps to 20,000 steps daily. And the women somewhere between 10,000 and 15,000 steps. To give you sort of a corollary here, in the Western world, we move about 3,000 steps daily to 5,000 steps daily on average. Now, of course, if you are someone who's a nurse or, a postal service provider who has a walking route, some people move much, much more than this. But the idea was, let's go study these hunter-gatherers, see how much more they're moving, and see how much this explains the obesity epidemic. And what they discovered blew him away and has blown everybody else away who's looked at this work since. And this is very recent work in the last 5 years or so in terms of when it was published. Essentially, what he found was, despite the fact that they were moving way more than us and accumulating much more daily activity, their total daily energy expenditure, the total amount of energy they burn, was almost exactly the same, was the same as the Western world. Now, I'm going to have to say this several times because it's so confusing. People go, I don't understand what you're actually saying. So when we look at energy use, there are several different components to this. There's resting energy expenditure, which is synonymous with basal metabolic rate. It's just the amount of energy that we burn at rest. It's largely synonymous with basal metabolic rate. There are some differences, but basically there's the part that we use when we're doing nothing. We just laid in bed all day. We would have to use energy to keep ourselves alive. So there's this basal metabolic rate, the amount of energy we use at rest. And then there's the amount of energy we use when we digest food. Every time we eat, we use some energy to digest that food. Now, almost always, in fact, always, if you're eating calories, you're always getting more calories than you are burning up through processing those calories. But this is called the thermic effect of food. And this thermic effect of food is small, but it is significant. We also have activities of daily living, which is just walking around. This would be doing the laundry, fidgeting, rolling around in your sleep, sex, walking to get the mail, washing the dishes, all of these things, taking the steps, standing rather than sitting. All of these things, activities of daily living, are huge. They make up about 20 to 15% of our total daily energy use. Science calls this non-exercise activity thermogenesis. This sort of fancy term. NEAT is the abbreviation for that. Then we also have EAT, exercise-associated thermogenesis, which is the activity, the energy we use through exercise. And this makes up about 5% of our total daily energy use. And so TDEE, total daily energy expenditure, is made up of all of these things: basal metabolic rate, thermic effect of food, activities of daily living, and exercise energy use. What Dr. Herman Ponzer discovered is that when you are exercising, after several weeks to months, what ends up happening is total daily energy expenditure starts to look almost exactly the same as it did previously. So as an example, let's say all of us decide we're going to go and enter one of these marathon running programs, right? And so we decide over the next 12 weeks to 24 weeks, we're going to start running. And we're going to slowly ramp up our activity and in this running. Now, in the beginning, our exercise activity thermogenesis, our EAT, the contribution of exercise use related to our total metabolism, will go up. And so we'll see a increase in total daily energy expenditure. Basal metabolic rate basically staying relatively the same. NEAT, staying relatively the same. EAT staying, going up. Exercise associated thermogenesis going up, and total daily energy expenditure going up. Now, but what happens over several weeks to months, based on Dr. Herman Ponzer's work, is that the metabolism begins to adapt and constrain itself. And so Dr. Ponzer calls this constrained energy expenditure. We were never aware of this before until this work, or we did not understand what was going on here. We still don't understand completely what's causing it, by the way. In the discussion with Dr. Herman Ponzer in episode 108, you could see us discussing what may be the cause. He has some ideas around that. But this constrained energy use, basically what it means is that as your activity levels go up, eventually the metabolism will start to budget other areas of energy use so that total daily energy expenditure does not change much. So for example, after 2 weeks of being on this marathon running program, of course, our energy use from exercise is going up and up. But in order to maintain our total daily energy use, what will happen is basal metabolic rate may fall a little bit through changes in hormones. The body does this to adapt. We don't know to what extent that is just yet and to what extent it's coming from basal metabolic rate. We know that the non-exercise associated thermogenesis activities of daily living go down. You fidget less, you move less, you're less motivated to walk around. And so what happens is the metabolism budgets and pulls back its energy use in other areas that are not exercise, so that total daily energy expenditure remains the same. And this is why we see very clearly in the research, and we've been seeing this for decades in the research, far longer than Herman Ponzer's work has been out, that exercise is a miserable way to achieve sustainable fat loss. In fact, it fails most of the time. And I often talk about one of my favorite studies, and I'll talk about it here again. Those of you who listen to this podcast have heard this over and over again. But this is a study of studies. It looked at 2 very large trials in exercising perimenopausal and postmenopausal women who did something similar to a marathon running program. They said, don't change your diet, and we're going to give you either a 30-minute, 45-minute, or 60-minute exercise session on a treadmill for 5 days per week. And they looked at these individuals and saw and tracked what happened to their weight loss. Now, 25% of these women lost weight. It wasn't as much weight as they expected based on the energy they were using. So there was some constrained effects here. But they did lose weight, 25%. But a full 75% did not lose weight. And actually 25% actually gained weight. So you might say, well, what's happening there? Why is that the case? Why do 75% of people who do these programs not get results? Well, first of all, it's individualized. So there are some people who will get these results, but most don't. And it has to do with this constrained metabolism effect, and also something that is a little bit more simple to understand, just simply excess hunger. So you can imagine that the metabolism goes, hey, we're using a lot of energy through exercise. I'm going to constrain the amount of energy I burn elsewhere. And I'm also going to increase the motivation for cravings and hunger so we can recoup some of that energy. So the metabolism is smart. It sees itself as paleo man, let's say, that it might end up out there on the plains of Africa and not have food. And so it makes sense that it would budget its energy use. And so this is what's happening with exercise. So then it brings up the question all of you have been asking me, so Jade, does this mean no exercise at all? Like, what are you actually saying? Isn't exercise healthy? And does it really not help with weight loss? Like, what's the deal here? Come on, explain this to me. I want to jump in real quick and tell you about one of my favorite new products. And to start out, I want to ask you a question. If you had to follow your friends around who are not the healthiest in the world and see what they are doing, what would be the number one thing you would probably tell them to do to start? For most people, that's going to be drinking more water, right? This is something that we talk about all the time in health and fitness. It's almost as if we think of it as an afterthought now because obviously water is so crucial. However, we oftentimes get this wrong. For example, did you know that when it comes to hydration, just drinking water can make things worse? Most people don't know this. Why? Partly because most people are over drinking water and under consuming the electrolytes that help water do its job. What we don't realize is that hydration is not just about water. It's about electrolytes, the minerals in there, as well as getting that water into the cells. And so you do not want to be over consuming water if you're not getting your electrolytes right. And this opens up a whole new discussion because most people are not getting their electrolytes right. For example, did you know that too low sodium is an issue? Just as much, if not more so, than high sodium. In other words, what we want if we're going to get the right electrolytes is to get the right amount of sodium and potassium and magnesium in the Goldilocks zone. We don't want too much. We don't want too little. We want it just right. This opens up a whole other thing here too, because people who are exercising, doing sauna therapies, doing low carb diets are disrupting and losing lots and lots of their electrolytes. For example, when insulin is not around in low carb diets, you will excrete lots of sodium. In other words, under that state, exercising, low carb diets, all these things, you actually need more sodium. And so if you're somebody who has been just drinking water, not paying attention to electrolytes, and also feeling fatigued, feeling like you're underperforming, not sleeping right, getting cramps, twitches, headaches, any of these things, then you are probably dealing with an electrolyte issue. This is where the product Element comes in. This product has been a game changer for me and many, many of my patients and clients. This is a rehydration electrolyte beverage, basically. It is a powder of electrolytes formulated with 1,000 milligrams of sodium, 200 milligrams of potassium, and 60 milligrams magnesium without the added sugar and other nonsense that comes in beverages like Gatorade. This stuff is basically a rehydration beverage on steroids. It is the thing that is going to replenish your electrolytes in the right ratios, decrease fatigue, really correct chronic dehydration. And by the way, many people are dehydrating themselves, becoming hyponatremic, low sodium, when they're consuming too much water. You need your electrolytes on board, especially if you are someone who is losing lots of sodium and other electrolytes through low carb diets and lots of exercise. This is where Element comes in. Element is a new sponsor to the Next Level Human podcast. I cannot recommend this product enough. I have been using this stuff for months now, and I have immediately seen changes in my energy levels. I feel like I'm operating on a whole other level, and I have seen this as being the primary thing that people who have been using Element have been telling me, that their fatigue is getting better, especially fatigue that comes after very intense workouts that involve lots of sweating and lots of intense output from the nervous system. Please check out Element. Use the code NEXTLEVEL. DrinkElement.com. That's DrinkLMNT.com. DrinkElement.com, and let's get back to the show. Sorry to break in. I want to cover one of my sponsors, Organifi. Now, look, I'm a little embarrassed to admit this, and many of you who know me well know this, but shockingly, I cannot stand vegetables. I really do not like vegetables. I have not liked them since a child. I think it has something to do with my mom, who cooked everything just boiled everything, no salt, no fat, no taste, period. And so I developed an extreme dislike for almost all vegetables. And still to this day, I have a difficult time getting in my fruits and vegetables. Well, Organifi, started by my good friend Drew Canoli, who I've developed a relationship over the years, and I am really sort of tickled that we finally get to do this together with Organifi sponsoring the Next Level Human podcast. Drew is a next level human. Organifi is a next level human company. I can't say enough about them. I'm excited for them to be on board as a sponsor for the Next Level Human podcast. My favorite products, let me tell you about them. They have a ton, but I use 3 pretty much every day. I use Organifi Gold before I go to sleep. This is their turmeric tea based on sort of the old Ayurvedic golden milk. It is absolutely fantastic. It contains lots of different relaxing herbs, turmeric, tastes wonderful. And one of the things this has done for me is I had a very bad wine habit at night. It started out as just 1 glass of wine. Lately, it's turned into 2, 3, and sometimes a bottle. What I've done starting in 2021 is use Organifi. This is what I have in lieu of wine. And I sit there just like I used to sit with my wine, and I have the Organifi Gold. I also use the green and red juice powders. I have never liked greens and reds juices, period. These powders to me always tasted like swamp water. I use 1 scoop of the greens, 1 scoop of the reds first thing in the morning before my coffee. It has become a ritual over the last several years. It is fantastic. Those are the ones I use the most. Of course, they have a great line of protein products, and they have a new Organifi Gold chocolate, which I have not tried yet, but I cannot wait to try that because you all know I love cocoa powder and use it for lots of different things, for cravings and everything else. Check out Organifi, Organifi.com. Use the code NEXTLEVEL. Please take care of Organifi the same way they're taking care of the earth, doing amazing things as a company, and now taking care of the Next Level Human podcast so we can all be together and have these discussions. Organifi.com. Use the code NEXTLEVEL. Let's get back to the show. Here we go. And so the truth of the matter is we don't yet know to the extent of what's causing this constrained effect, but we do know a couple other things. And it is important for the exercising public and you coaches and those of you who are here just for your own health and fitness goals to understand what this is about. So while we know conclusively that exercise is horrible to attain weight loss and fat loss, and this work by Herman Ponzer explains why some of this is true, we also know that it's critical in terms of maintaining weight loss. So in a sense, if you're going to lose weight, you kind of want to do it with diet and minimal exercise. But to maintain that weight, that's when you ramp up your exercise. So the first rule, number 1, the first thing to write down and to remember based on this new understanding is that while exercise might not be great to lose weight with, it is great to maintain the weight that you do lose with. In other words, maybe we need to start thinking of exercise as something that we ramp up after weight loss. Maybe we need to start thinking about weight loss being strictly about focusing on diet and calorie reduction through diets rather than exercise. Now, so that's the first thing to understand here. So maybe instead of saying, I'm going to lose weight and I'm going to start exercising 6 days a week and cut my calories, maybe what we need to start saying is, I want to lose weight, so I'm going to cut my calories down with food and I'm going to exercise 1, 2 times, maybe 3 times per week max. This is where this whole idea of eat less, exercise less comes from, right? You're driving calorie deficits through food, not through exercise. And then later, after you've lost the weight or taking a break from this sort of calorie deficit, you can move into something that is more oriented towards ramping up your exercise. So maybe after the weight is lost, you go from 1, 2, or 3 workouts per week to 4, 5, or 6 workouts per week. And remember, always thinking what you can sustain. So if you know right now, I can't sustain more than 3 exercise sessions per week, then maybe you want to do only 1 exercise session per week as you're trying to lose the weight and instead focus on walking and those kinds of things instead of intense exercise to mitigate this constrained response and decrease some of this hunger response. Now, of course, this is individualized. If you're someone who knows, hey, I respond well to exercise, I actually do lose weight with exercise, you're one of these 25%, let's say, then keep doing it. But for the rest of us, 75%ers, maybe this is something that we need to do. Now, the other thing about exercise is that this old view, one of the things that came out of Herman Ponzer's work is that this old view that we want to speed up the metabolism with supplements and with exercise is wrong, because speeding up metabolism means we're speeding up this constrained effect and speeding up hunger. So oftentimes this idea of speeding metabolism leads to weight regain, because we're also speeding up hunger and speeding up this constrained metabolic response. So instead, what we want to think about is keeping our metabolism flexible and responsive and adaptive and less rigid. And so what that means is that we need to do something that will keep us flexible, being able to tap into our fat stores when we need it, tap into our glucose stores when we need it, use our flex fuel, which I regard as protein, when we need it. And this is where exercise is actually critical. So for example, one of the things we know is that people who exercise have lower resting cortisol levels. Despite having high cortisol levels during exercise, they tend to have lower resting cortisol levels at rest. This goes for all types of exercisers, by the way. This goes for cardio people, this goes for yoga people, this goes for weight trainers. Anyone who is working out tends to have lower resting cortisol as compared to non-exercising people. Likewise, people who work out also are able to more maintain their muscle mass and even perhaps increase their muscle mass, which has a minimal but perhaps important function for keeping basal metabolic rate, resting metabolic rate elevated, and also, probably more importantly, increasing the amount of exercise energy you burn. For example, we know that having an extra pound of muscle is not that beneficial for resting energy expenditure or basal metabolic rate. You get maybe 6 extra calories to 30 extra calories per pound of muscle that you put on. And by the way, you get somewhere between 3 and 6 per pound of fat that you have. And so you can see this is not a really good way to ramp up metabolism. But the more muscle that you have, the more energy you will use when you start to move that muscle or exercise that muscle. And so one of the things we want to think about is this idea that exercising, especially exercise that maintains your muscle, keeps the metabolism flexible. And one of the things that also shows is that, again, this is individual, but exercise also can help with people to mitigate some of this hunger and craving response. So this is going to seem confusing because I'm seeming to contradict myself now, but keep in mind, this is an individual response. Exercise research shows that exercise can increase hunger and cravings, but that also exercise training can decrease hunger and cravings. And you might say, well, Jade, that's 2 different things. This is confusing. I hate when science does this. This is individual responses, right? So whenever you see science that has sort of these different sort of take-homes where it's like one study says this and another study says the opposite, then the other study says the opposite, and the other study says the opposite of that, that usually means what you're uncovering there is individual responses. And so what we want to do is we want to find exercise that actually helps some of us regulate hunger and cravings and energy intake. So there's something about exercise for many, many people that helps to maintain basal metabolic rate, that also can, the right type of exercise, help hunger and cravings. And we have to sort of look at this. We haven't teased this out yet. Right now, based on the research, I can give you some of these caveats. This might be number 2 thing you want to write down. In general, walking in the sort of 10,000 to 20,000 steps per day kind of place doesn't seem to, for the vast majority of people, have any effect on hunger and may actually decrease it to a degree. However, once you go much longer with your exercise sessions in the moderate intensity zone, like so now you're power walking or jogging or stuff like that, for many people, not all, this will increase hunger. Let's just go with the 75%. It might increase hunger. For the other 25%, maybe not as much. So this seems to be the area that might be the most difficult in terms of hunger and cravings, that cardiovascular exercise may actually trigger hunger in most people, not all. Short intense exercise has a short-term hunger suppressing effect acutely and then seems to raise hunger perhaps in the same way regular cardio does. But it does give this brief sort of period where your hunger is under control, and then you can get a protein shake on board or something healthy on board to keep you from craving later. Weight training seems to be somewhere in between. And so this is one of the reasons why we now get into this thing. Well, what should I be doing? Well, when you look at all of this across the board, weight training seems to be the best thing to do because it helps to maintain and or gain muscle to help mitigate some of this loss in basal metabolic rate. It also seems to perhaps not have the same hunger issues. Not to mention, when you are breaking down muscle, you actually need extra calories to repair that muscle. And so resistance training is one of the only forms of exercise that has this really nice effect of driving excess calories into muscle gain rather than fat gain. It's important for all of us to understand, just because you have excess calories does not mean that you're always going to be storing fat. You could also be storing muscle if you've broken that muscle down and it needs to repair and adapt. This is one of the reasons I often tell people, listen, you want to eat more when you're exercising a lot more. So when you're training hard with weights, that's when you want to eat in and around that period. So if I go into a weekend perhaps and I'm going to do a Friday workout, a Saturday workout, a Sunday workout, then maybe I want to start eating more Thursday night into Monday morning so I can eat more in and around the time I'm training really hard to help with recovery, repair, and adaptation. This is another reason why weight training is so critical in this regard. And so the first thing we could say is weight training is probably the best thing you can do to mitigate hunger and to mitigate some of this constrained response. Now, we will not know for sure until Dr. Ponzer and his team or other researchers actually look at cardio and its constrained and hunger responses versus weight training and its constrained and hunger responses. But we do have hints in the research right now, and we also have the clinical experience of this as well. And so this is a good assumption to begin to make. And so the first thing here is, what kind of exercise should I be doing? Well, first, should I exercise? Yes. When should I exercise? Well, you should exercise more to maintain the weight that you lost versus exercising more when you're losing the weight. So that's the second thing here. And then what type of exercise to do? Weight training. And then this brings us into the discussion, well, what about Orange Theory? And what about cardio? And what about all these other things that I might love? These things are healthy and they're beneficial. In fact, a lot of people don't realize that in a lot of the research out there, when you combine weight training with cardio, they actually are synergists for each other. In other words, weight training helps to maintain some of the muscle and helps amplify some of the fat burning effects of cardio. And likewise, cardio helps to burn some of the fat, whereas weight training increases some of the muscle. And so they do work somewhat synergistically together. So the idea has always been, it's one of the reasons even in practical settings, when you look at people, it would be like, hey, do cardio one day, weight training the next day. And then as we went along, many people started doing concurrent training where they do cardio first, then weights, or weights, then cardio. And then finally, that moved into sort of metabolic conditioning where this sort of cardio and weights was merged into a very fast-paced weight training routine that elicited a cardiovascular response. And so what I would say is that as long as you are balancing weight training with cardiovascular exercise, then that's the right way to do it. Probably what you don't really want to do is you probably don't want to be doing cardio by itself. You probably want to be doing some kind of weight training for most people. Now, of course, there are plenty of people who do cardio by itself and get fantastic results. I would say these are in the minority. For most of us, we're going to want to prioritize weight training and then sprinkle in cardio on top of that. Now, of course, one of the major reasons people do not exercise is time. And so we can shorten down this time by decreasing rest periods when we're lifting weights. In fact, if I give you a workout like bench press, deadlift, squat, these big compound movements, and then I tell you, I want you to take very little rest, 30 seconds or a minute between these sets, what will happen is you will get out of breath very quickly. Also, though, that what will happen is it will limit your ability to recover and lift the heaviest weights possible. So while this concurrent type of intermittent type of intermixed metabolic conditioning is really good for fat loss, perhaps, or at least keeping the metabolism flexible, it is not nearly as good for muscle gain. So as soon as you are in the goal set of I want to build muscle, one of the things you have to understand is rest between sets become critical as a way to reset the muscle and the nervous system so that you can create the maximum amount of volume and the maximum amount of tension on the muscles. So this is why we oftentimes say if weight gain, muscle gain is your goal, then doing things like metabolic conditioning and CrossFit and stuff like that are not going to be the best way to go about this. Instead, what you are going to want to do is take long rests between sets, 2 to 3 minutes, rather than short rests between sets. And so this is really what we want to be doing. And it's really as simple as this. This new understanding essentially just says, listen, we need to be a little bit more careful with exercise. It's not about speeding up metabolism. It's not about doing more exercise. It's about being smarter. And we want to avoid this constrained response and this hunger and craving response, especially if we know we are someone who is going to have this response, that this is an individual response for us. Not everybody has this. And so then the rules are, yes, exercise. Prioritize exercise after you've lost the weight, not during. That's number one. Number two, know your hunger and craving responses and make sure that you're paying attention to these things. Move as much as possible in terms of in that 10,000 to 20,000 step range, and exercise only just enough. My suggestion is while you're losing weight, you move, you focus on calorie reduction, you do 1 to 3 workouts, primarily weight training based or intermixed. So not cardio alone, get the weights in there. And then after you've lost the weight, you move more towards increasing the frequency of exercise. At that point, you can go to 3 workouts per week to 6 workouts per week. And again, focus on intermixed workouts, either cardio one day, weights one day, or a day where you do cardio first and weights next, or weights first and cardio next, or something like a CrossFit or a boot camp or something where you're intermixing the weight training with the cardio, or lifting weights faster, meaning not faster in terms of rep speed, but faster in terms of less rest between sets to elicit a cardiovascular response. And the one caveat with that would be that if you're wanting muscle gain, you do not want to take these, you don't want to be breathless. You don't want to be taking these very short rest periods. Instead, what you want is longer rest periods, right? This is how you want to be thinking about this. This will keep your metabolism flexible. This will help you get the results that you want. And so do not hear that we should not be exercising. And we still need time for science to catch up to see if what I'm explaining here actually holds true over the long run. Right now, this is my best guess to pass on to you all who are asking this question. So I'm going to end the podcast here. It's a short one today. I hope you got your questions answered in this regard, and I will see you at the next podcast. Oh, and by the way, I just want to say thank you to everyone who has been, it's been amazing seeing lots and lots of different reviews going up on the podcast. I so appreciate that. I appreciate those of you who have sent me your reviews and asking for these kinds of podcasts. And so if you would be so kind, go over to Apple, leave a review for me, screenshot it, send it to me, and ask me for what you want. There are certain things that I am making a list as I go down that people are saying, Jade, please do a podcast on this. Jade, please do a podcast on that. And I will be happy to do that for you. But I would love to get your feedback. Thanks so much for all the reviews and the love, and I will see you at the next podcast.